Welcome and thank you so much for being here today. I am excited to talk about the Duolingo Stories feature. We're going to first explain what stories are, just in case you haven't seen it before, and then talk about how they're made with a focus on how we develop our stories so that learners at any proficiency level can engage with them. Before we get started doing that, I do want to introduce myself. My name is Cindy. I'm a learning scientist at Duolingo. I work on a team with a lot of other learning experts, and I also work on the team that develops stories content. As a learning expert, I have a background in applied linguistics. I also spent some time studying creative writing, and I was an English as a second language teacher as well. And all of that means that Duolingo was a really great place to land for me, and I've really enjoyed working on this feature as well. Let's begin by talking about what Duolingo stories are. And again, I want to talk about this because there's a good chance some of you, depending on the languages that you've been learning at Duolingo, you might not have actually encountered stories. And that's because we only have stories within certain courses right now. One of my jobs is to expand our stories offerings to other languages as quickly as possible, and we're working on that. But just in case you haven't encountered them organically on your own, I want to explain a little bit about what they are, and then I'll show you the demo in just a minute as well. So first and foremost, stories tell stories. They're bite-sized narratives. They do get a little bit longer as you move down through a course, but that's good. They're designed to do that because you're actually gaining proficiency in that language, and we know that you can handle more story at that point. The stories are simplified quite a bit as well, and we have a really specific process for doing that, and I'll explain a little bit more how that works, but the goal is that, again, it's something even if you are really early French beginner, let's say, you can still read a story in French. And in fact, to help you out even more, in addition to simplification, we have translations available if you need it on the stories. You can just tap on one of the words and access the translation and keep going. You'll see that in just a minute in the demo. And then we also have questions that pop up throughout the story as you move down through it. And these are designed to do a few different things. First, we definitely want learners to pay attention. So at times, we're just really making sure that you are engaged with the story as much as you could be. But we also design these questions to help you out a little bit, especially if there is some difficult grammar maybe, or a cultural concept that we think could be explained. We'll sometimes kind of embed that explanation within the question itself to provide some guidance to you. Okay, so that's enough of what stories are. Let me just actually show you what one of these looks like. So we're about to see actually the very first story in the set of Spanish stories that are available. So this is for English speakers who are learning Spanish. And here we go. You'll see in just a minute that there's actually a stories tab at the bottom of the screen. And so you would tap that tab first, and then you'd be able to access the stories.
Buenos días. Héctor está en casa con su esposa María.
Buenos días, María.
Buenos días, mi amor.
All right, now that you know what the stories look like, we're going to move on to talking about why they're good for learning. First, though, because this is a question that I get asked all the time, I do want to tell you specifically which courses have stories so that you're not looking for them for no reason. As you probably know by this point at Duolingo, our courses are a little unique. We don't just have one Spanish course, for example, or one German course. We have a Spanish course for English speakers, or we might have a French course for Spanish speakers. So for our learners who are English speakers, who already have a good command of English, they can access stories in the French course from English, German, Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish. And then we also have English stories for speakers of Spanish, Portuguese, Chinese, and Russian. So that is 9 courses where we currently have stories right now. All right, moving on, I want to talk briefly about why stories are good for learning, because the answer to that question might seem obvious, but there's actually a lot to talk about here. In fact, I could probably spend the entire talk on this alone, but I promise I won't. we'll move on soon. But first and foremost, Duolingo stories offer reading and listening practice. Again, that's probably the most obvious one, but we're really excited about the reading and listening they provide because there is so much language involved that you otherwise might not necessarily be getting in the course, depending on where you are in the course. And when we talk about exposing learners to additional language, we don't just mean the quantity, we also mean the type of language learners are being exposed to. So especially think about the kind of language that you need to use if you want to interact or speak in the language you're learning. A lot of this is going to show up in stories. Things like ordering food, asking directions, the kind of language you use when you take turns, like yeah, uh-huh, wow, things like that. And additionally, a lot of emotion shows up in the stories as well. You can hear how words are emphasized or how the tone changes if someone is surprised or asking a question. All of that is really valuable for learners to encounter. Another reason why stories are great for learning is they boost confidence. And we know from research that motivation really helps language acquisition. So we love when we hear from learners things like, I can't believe I'm reading in French. This is really great for us to hear. And the final reason why we think stories are really great for learning is because they are entertaining. They're fun. And people learn more when they come back every day to do their Duolingo lessons in courses and in stories. And on the stories team, we really like to collect feedback on social media. And I have a few of them just real quickly to share with you all. This one says, you'd think the sole merit would be being stuffed full of vocab, but they're actually full of drama, intrigue, plot twists, and gasp-inducing endings. Couple more here. Loving the Duolingo stories option and would love a Netflix film adaptation of this unfolding drama, please. So would I. The drama on Duolingo stories is intense. And my favorite TV drama is Duolingo stories. So let's move on to talking about how stories are made. And one thing you'll notice if you've ever used stories is that there are a lot of them. So here you can see someone scrolling through their set of stories from top to bottom. If you are one of those stories users who's made your way down to the bottom through our multiple sets of stories, you've noticed that they get a lot harder. So why is that? What exactly is happening there? The stories are indeed getting harder, and that's not an accident. To explain that a bit, it's helpful to know how at Duolingo we determine the appropriate level for content across all of our features, whether it's stories or courses or podcasts or audio lessons. For all of these things, we use what's called the Common European Framework of Reference. We refer to this as the CEFR. And it is an external standard that we use to ensure that the content in our features is appropriate for learners at exactly the point they're at in their language learning journey. The CFR, as you can see here, is broken into 6 levels. A1 is for early beginners to a language, and C1 is the most proficient use of the language. And to explain a little bit how the CFR works, I have some sample sentences for you. The best way to think of these guidelines is as descriptors for what a person should be able to do with the language at the various levels. So at the A1 level, someone might be able to say, the cat is not playing. And you can see here, that's true. It's very accurate. It's fine. It's grammatically correct. At an A2 level, though, that same learner farther along in their journey might say, let's try moving the toy more. At a B1 level, we might hear, let me try. He'll play more if we wiggle the string. Of course, wiggle is a less frequent word, probably not showing up in early language learning textbooks. At the B2 level, we might hear, when we were at the store, you should have bought the other cat wand. There was more movement, so he'd have liked it more. Getting wordier here, more complex grammatically, and then we get to C level, C1. Let's ponder some of the factors that have gone into the cat's decision not to play with the toy. And way up at a C2 level, which, by the way, we try not to equate this with native-like language because some native speakers don't even get to this level. It requires often a a really quality educational background or technical learning or something. And you can see here at C2 level, if one were to apply just a hint more kinetic force to the feline's plaything, the creature might shed its lethargic nature and engage in jollity. We sometimes refer to this as Obama level command of the language. But these are our 6 CFR levels, and we'll move on, but I do want to mention these because I'll reference them later, especially when we talk about simplification. But what you see here now are the 5 steps that any story goes through in the process, from very initial idea to something that shows up on your phone that you get to enjoy. And those steps are writing, simplification, adaptation, production, and then the publishing itself. So we'll talk about each of these here. Okay, let's start by talking about the very first phase, which is the writing itself. All of our writing is done initially in English for the stories. We have a group of really talented writers who have worked on cool projects like Sesame Street or Looney Tunes, and they create pitches, 30 words or less usually, for stories that they want to develop, and then we give feedback on those pitches. And we think about a lot of different things. We think about whether the characters they're describing would actually do and say these things they're proposing, but we also think about the level that we're targeting, and this goes back to the CEFR that I described previously. So for example, if a writer proposes a really cool story, but we don't quite think it'll work at an A1 level for those early learners, we might save it and pull it back out when we get to B1, when we have more complicated language that we can use to tell that story and really make it stick. So once we decide what our favorite pitches are, then we give the writers the thumbs up to develop the first draft. That becomes a second draft, maybe a third draft, but usually we arrive at something that's really working. Then at that point, it needs to be simplified. And for this, we have also very talented language editors. These are folks who have backgrounds in linguistics or language teaching, and they look at the story and think, what do we need to do to change this so that someone at the A1 level, for example, can read this story and understand what's happening and feel confident? And so for this, they use a lot of our internally created vocabulary and grammar lists that align with the CEFR. They look at our course curricula to make sure that we are using the same words or the same grammar that shows up in courses, and they'll go in and simplify the story. They will substitute certain words. It's a really interesting job, and it's tough to train for this linguistic simplification, but our editors do a great job of it. After simplification, when we finally have a story that works and we're telling it well with our simplified language, then we adapt it to all the other languages where we want this story. This is more than just translation. There's of course translation involved, but our adapters will also do really interesting things to keep the language accessible in the new translated version. A good example of this, of course, is that the subjunctive is really difficult in Spanish. And so if the most obvious translation would have the subjunctive in Spanish, they might just rewrite those couple sentences in such a way to avoid subjunctive. We also do some cultural changes here. So dollars might become euros, or Paris might become London. That all happens at this adaptation phase. Then we go into production. At this phase, we have the voice actors perform the lines aloud. Sound engineers then take that audio and sync it up with the text. We also get from our wonderful designers here the cover illustrations and avatars, and you can see here, this is just a quick screenshot of the full list of characters that are in our stories editor that I always like to look through. You can see all the characters that have showed up historically in stories and what their names are across different languages. So that's one of my favorite things to look at. And after production, we are ready to publish. We add what we call hints. These are the translations as you're reading the story. If you need to tap and see those, we test them to make sure they're working well, and then we publish, which is the moment when we share these stories with learners, which is by far the best part of the process. In terms of time, it usually takes about 3 weeks for a story to get from pitch to an approved draft, maybe another 2 weeks for adaptation and production, maybe another couple weeks for the illustrations. So a story goes through quite a journey from that initial idea to something that you see in the app itself. All right, last I want to talk about what's next for stories, because that's also a question I get a lot. First, we're hoping to bring stories to more languages as soon as we can. We do want to bring stories to Japanese in the next year for English speakers, and also we're currently working on English for Japanese speakers, and then I'm sure in 2021 we'll have some other languages as well that we're working toward. Also, keep your eye on stories because we're adding more every day. We're especially focused on trying to make that experience of moving from the more simple stories to the more difficult ones a little more gradual. Right now, you may have noticed that as you're moving through stories, you're feeling pretty good if you're at the top of the course, and then suddenly there is this jump in difficulty, and you might be using those hints a whole lot more than you did before. So this is something we're working on, and we're developing more stories at that A1 level, at that A2 level, so that we can give you a more gradual experience and more content in general. I'm also really excited because we're now writing stories with Project Duolingo World characters in them. And in fact, you may have already seen some of these characters in the stories in the app right now. I know Greg already introduced these characters earlier today, but I just want to say that it's really great to develop stories with their personalities in mind, with their unique backgrounds and preferences. We talk a lot about their relationships, their friendships, how they interact with one another, and how that plays out in the stories that we're developing now. And here you can see, again, I know you already met them, but we have Zari and Bee and Lily and Lucy and Duo, and there are of course more characters, so keep an eye on stories for that as well. Finally, you may have already seen this if you do stories on iOS, but we have listen-only mode coming to stories, and it will be on all platforms eventually. This you would encounter if you're redoing a story. So you completed the story all the way to the end, and then maybe later you want to go back up and redo it just for practice. This time you're going to see that one of the character's lines have been blurred out. And for that character, it's a listen-only experience. So this really ramps up the difficulty when you experience stories the second time, but we think it will be really good for your listening comprehension. And of course, as you can see here, if you need a little help, you can tap Reveal to see the line again and have access to the hints. Okay, that's all I have for today, but I want to thank you again very much for your time. It was a pleasure to be here and talk to you about stories today. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them, but mostly thank you for your time and thank you for being Duolingo learners.
Cindy, that was really fun, and now when I'm doing the stories I'm going to be thinking about the Looney Tunes and Sesame Street writers that are behind them. That's amazing. But a lot of people want to know, why aren't there stories in more languages, in all the languages? People just want their stories.
Yeah, that is the #1 question that I get about stories. And my answer is we're working on it. We really are. These stories require a lot of time and resources. So right now, we're prioritizing our courses that have the most learners in them because we really want to serve the majority of our learners where we can. However, we know that there are learners across the courses in Duolingo, so we are actively expanding stories to new languages. This comes up every quarter when we decide what the team's going to work on. And I can't make any specific promises right now beyond the courses I already mentioned, but I can tell you that there are a lot of new courses we're looking at for 2021. So stay tuned, and we hear you. We're working on it.
How do the writers decide what they're going to write about? I've been doing some of the French stories, and the people in the stories lead some very rich lives.
They do. They do. I think about this a lot because we're constantly talking about our characters and what they would do and what they wouldn't do. Right now, we have, as I mentioned, some really great writers who brainstorm pitches every week. And we look at these as a group and we decide which stories will work, whether certain characters are behaving in the way that we have envisioned them behaving. I know we already heard from Greg today. He talked a lot about the world characters. There's a separate group at Duolingo who thinks very carefully about these characters and what their personalities are and their various motivations. And so we refer to their notes a lot when we think about what should happen in the stories. And so we choose our favorite pitches, and then those go on to become first drafts. And even then, we might decide, you know what? This actually just doesn't feel like B. I think we need to scrap this story, or maybe save it for another character at some time. So that's kind of some of what we think about when we think about what the writers are going to develop. But we also consider the learning side of the stories as well. So we know that there are these, as I mentioned, CEFR competencies, these things that learners should be able to do with the language. And so we really want to show the characters doing those things as well, whether it's asking directions because they're lost or ordering coffee in a cafe. These are all the communicative competencies that our learners need. So we try to integrate that as well.
How do you achieve that balance where it sounds like natural speech and not like a textbook, but it's simple enough for learners to understand and close enough to the educational version versus informal slang version?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it's a daily challenge, honestly. It's something that we work carefully on because what the writers produce often in their first draft as English speakers is often very natural sounding and appropriate for English. But then when we simplify that, A, and adapt it to other languages, B, it can turn out quite different. There is a risk of it seeming stilted. And on some level, we can't entirely avoid that when we're simplifying these texts. But one thing we do try hard to include in the stories are kind of prefabricated chunks of language, expressions that are really useful in the language you're learning, conversational, at a very basic level, something like good morning, but at more advanced levels, maybe it doesn't matter, or I have no idea. Something that speakers say a lot and that can be memorized as a chunk and used in really useful functional ways is one way that we try to strike that balance. But honestly, it's something we're still perfecting, I think.
So the English stories are available for speakers of multiple different languages. Do you have to change them so that someone whose original language is Spanish gets a slightly different version to someone whose original language is, say, Russian?
We don't change them too much, actually. The main way that we support learners with various language backgrounds there is through the hints, which are the translations that are available in your background language by tapping the word or phrase. Something else that we do is the questions that pop up as learners move through a story. At the earlier levels, those are also translated into your background language, so they're a little easier for you to handle, to process, and to answer. So those also are translated into the background language, which provides additional support. Other than that, we try not to change the English version too much as we adapt so that learners are, for the most part, getting a similar experience when they encounter our English stories.
And some of the story scenarios are quite weird in a delightful way. Are the writers doing that deliberately because they know that people enjoy the weirdness?
Yeah, I would say we're kind of leaning into the weirdness at this point. We want to make sure that we provide an engaging experience for a wide variety of readers. To the extent that's possible, we don't want our stories to be too culturally specific to one language community or another. In reality, that's impossible, so there is probably going to be a little bit of an English-dominant cultural component to our stories. But we do challenge ourselves to have the characters stumbling into all sorts of weird things. We do want them to be funny. We love it when we find out that our learners are laughing out loud. And we want some of our characters to be a little bit bizarre and strange. And we hope that this increases learners' enjoyment and causes them to read more.
Have the writers ever gone too far and you're like, no, that is too weird, rein it in?
Yes, but I'm not going to tell you exactly what too far looked like. But yes, that happens
Cindy.
sometimes.
Would you ever get writers who were writing not in English to originate stories?
You know, this is something that we've talked about a lot with this feature. And in early days of the feature, prior to my involvement, actually, they were experimenting with having, for example, a Spanish speaker writing Spanish stories only for learners who were studying Spanish. And the problem with that was really just that it was too slow. And so this is, again, a balance that we're attempting to achieve between content that is appropriate for learners and engaging and culturally interesting with content that we can actually just bring to as many learners as possible, as quickly as possible. So right now we're not working on that, but it's definitely something we would consider for the future.
How long does it take then to put the stories together from the germ of the idea to them being published?
Yeah, it is about 3 weeks to get a story from the initial pitch idea up into a polished English version of a story that we're happy with. We're happy with the simplification and we're happy with the creative content as well. That's about 3 weeks. Then we pass it on to the adaptation and production teams, and they're fast. They can usually adapt the story to other languages, depending on how many we're trying to do at once, get the hints, get the voice recording, all of that ready to be tested and recorded in about 2 to 3 weeks. So we're looking at 5 to 6 weeks for a story from soup to nuts.
Do you have a favorite?
It changes over time, but one story I really like is actually one of the older stories. It doesn't even have one of our world characters in it, though I would kind of like to rewrite it with some of our world characters. And it's this couple who has lofty ideas about a camping trip, and it turns out they're just not really cut out for the outdoors. And
Lofty ideas about camping.
Yeah,
Disasters waiting to happen.
Yeah, I think I relate to that one.
Well, thank you so much, Cindy. It is the stories are a pleasure, and it's a pleasure also to learn about them.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to talk about them and answer some questions.